Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful. Hello and welcome to Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. Today we are going to be having Sui Chung, a human rights defender, and Dr. Alan Meca, an associate professor, talking about immigration and immigrant justice. It is June 26th, 2026, and let's get into it. First, Sui Chung is executive director of Americans for Immigrant Justice, Florida's largest nonprofit immigrant defense law firm. She's an award-winning leader of the immigration bar. In 2023, the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild honored Sui with the Lisa Brodiaga Award for her contributions in advancing the rights of immigrants. The American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, awarded her 3 times with national awards. During multiple terms, AILA National appointed her to chair its national ICE and EOIR liaison committees, where she represented the interests of over 16,000 immigration attorneys nationwide. Additional highlights of her career have included co-representing the lead Florida Supreme Court case addressing immigrants' right to effective representation in criminal proceedings, representing arguably the most famous unaccompanied minor from the award-winning nonfiction novel Enrique's Journey, leading groundbreaking court-appointed representation of mentally incompetent immigrants, and representing AI Justice and other organizations as amicus curiae counsel in briefings before the United States Supreme Court. Welcome, Sui. Then we have Dr. Alan Meca, an associate professor and assistant chair for faculty affairs in the Department of Psychology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Dr. Meca's work examines the psychological processes that shape how individuals navigate cultural contexts and life transitions, with a particular emphasis on promoting well-being among diverse populations. This work has led to substantive research on identity development, acculturation, and cultural stress, particularly among immigrant and minoritized populations. Dr. Meca has published over 120 peer-review articles and has secured more than $3.7 million in external grant funding to support his work. In addition to his scholarship, he is actively engaged in mentoring graduate and undergraduate students and contributes to professional service within the field of psychology. Welcome, Dr. Meca. Let's start with Sui. How did you get involved in work on immigrant justice?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. We're very grateful for this opportunity. I really started, I think my exposure to human rights and defense work was even before entering law school. I had the opportunity to have an internship in criminal defense. And, I think anyone who has worked in criminal defense, they can very quickly realize the inequitable system that we live in, how poverty, how circumstances, how our communities are run, that you can see that there's an impact on those who are vulnerable. So I think that initial exposure really drove me to want to pursue a career in human rights, which is essentially how immigration law, that is our human rights law in the United States, is doing immigration law. And perhaps it really did come from the fact that I'm second generation Korean American. My parents immigrated from Korea. My father came invited as a physician, but I think our experience was really different. It wasn't that he came here and he was a physician, and what one would imagine a physician's career to be was just standard and regular and meeting expectations. He was assigned to an underserved community. And that is what our medical community is doing, our immigrant medical community doing, is going to underserved areas and really providing services that are just gravely needed in our American communities. And so my experience was really different being in Illinois, very, very not diverse, but such a welcoming place, really, really welcoming community. And I really often ask myself whether, if I was experiencing that again today, whether we would feel the same welcoming environment. And I really hope that I could answer yes to that. But of course, I think that our nation has really changed and evolved in some of many respects on how the word immigration is used and the word immigrant is used. But I have to relay that going to an underserved community, going to a community where no one looked like me, we were welcomed with open arms. And that really is what brings me a lot of hope in trying to drive the work that we do at Americans for Immigrant Justice, that our nation can overcome, some of the very negative conversations that have been occurring around immigration.
You're mentioning negative associations with immigrant populations, challenges that immigrants face professionally, personally. What does immigrant justice today mean to you?
Well, I think today we really are focused on the aspect of due process. What I've known as an attorney, I think what many of us have known as attorneys, really has changed in terms of how we defend immigrants. I just underscoring the fact that we haven't had a major change to the Immigration and Nationality Act since 1996. So everything that people are seeing today and the policies that are being driven are from the executive branch. This is interpreted based on the administration. So we see changes based on those administrative changes. And I think that we have to look at that carefully and ask ourselves, well, where were we in 96? People weren't using the internet. Our needs were really different. Our economy was really different. And this big necessity for us to change what we had established then and what may or may not have been workable then, definitely we need to readdress today. So when we're looking at immigrant justice and how these push factors are becoming politicized in terms of how we want to drive immigration policy, this really has to be coming from the legislature. Congress really needs to pass laws that give us, fair and safe mechanisms for immigration policies. But what we're experiencing today is even just basic due process rights being violated. For example, Americans for Immigrant Justice, we are co-counsel with the ACLU on the litigation that pertained to the Everglades Detention Center, which is known as Alligator Alcatraz. For many weeks, people had no access to counsel. There was no system in place. There was no ability to engage with counsel, to even get a hearing before a judge. There was no court that took jurisdiction until we were able to make progress on shedding light on these extreme violations. I think that the American public would be stunned to know that people were being held pretty much incommunicado and without access to counsel. I don't think that that's something that the US public would really accept, that people would be pretty much in a black hole with no ability to petition for release or make a claim or even make known or ask the question, why am I here today? These are stories that we hear from other nations, not our nation. So I think that focusing on the changes that pertain to how operations are being conducted, we're asking ourselves, really, is this a nation we want to live in? And how do we defend the rights of immigrants? Not even talking about the benefits piece, defend the rights of immigrants as humans.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the work that you do. Let me turn to Dr. Meca, and if you could tell us a little bit about what you study in plain language and how it relates to immigrant justice.
So broadly, I study how people define themselves in the question and answer the question, "Who am I?" So, by the core of what I do, I study identity development. So again, that question to the answer that we have to the question, "Who am I?" And oftentimes for individuals of immigrant backgrounds or ethnic racial minoritized populations in the United States, that question inevitably turns to aspects of our cultural heritage, our connection to our nationality, right? So what does it mean for me, for example, as a second generation Hispanic immigrant, to be Hispanic, to be American? And that often means that we're navigating various contexts. It's giving us mixed messages or sometimes messages that are aligned about both of those identities, right? I'm not Hispanic enough for Hispanic individuals, but I'm also not American enough for Americans. Like those messages, those pressures that you feel that are those push and pulls to kind of try to be the best of both worlds, but never really living up. And that's where a lot of my work has focused on, is this intersection between how we define ourselves within the context of these kind of cultural streams, is what we call them, but also the stressors associated with navigating those processes, in addition to the stressors that unfortunately are seen heavily by immigrant and ethnic racial minoritized populations, including things like discrimination, microaggression, foreign objectification. So like the sense that you're always a foreigner, even if you were born here, or even if you've achieved legal status or citizenship, even naturalized citizenship, right? This sense that like you're never really here, right? And these are messages that essentially degrade our capacity to view ourselves as members of this country, as members of this society. So that's kind of really what my work has focused on. And in the context of, immigrant justice, the process of immigration, is a very complex process. Obviously, it has legal aspects I wouldn't even try to speak to, but it also has substantive psychosocial aspects to it, of what it means to move from, your social context that you've been familiar with for, a good chunk of your life, assuming that you're coming in as an adolescent or adult, and adapting to a new social ecological context that you're unfamiliar with, right? What does it mean to now be challenged with, the I am this thing, right? Like, if you think about my father came to this country from Cuba and the Mariel, and he went from being Cuban to essentially being Hispanic, right? Like even the switch to this pan-ethnic label that is not really normative for people from the countries that they're immigrating from, right? And now having to kind of be socialized towards it, right? In addition to having to navigate, American practices, behaviors, cultures, and this kind of push that is often felt towards assimilation, towards Americanization, right? Which does not necessarily necessitate the relinquishing of one's heritage and cultural background. So what I would say is, as how my work involves relates to immigrant justice, is really thinking about what are those psychological transitions that are happening for immigrant populations, as well as what is the messaging around, some of these stressors that immigrant populations are experiencing in terms of, the likelihood of them assimilating, of them integrating into American society, right? What messaging is being experienced by these populations? How is this compromising their mental health, given the substantive literature that's emerged, showcasing that these stressors, increase depressive symptoms, anxiety, compromise well-being, increase risky behavior, such as like substance use. So, the toll of these things is really pronounced, and has important implications that we need to be thinking about as we not just provide essential services to allow for things like due process, allow for transition, but also think about how do we support optimal mental health and transition, and really create a context in which immigrants can thrive, right? Like we want not only to welcome, but we want to create opportunities where all people are really able to thrive within the society. That's to the benefit of everyone.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Meca. So, tell me a little bit about what your work involves. What does a day in the life look like for you at Americans for Immigrant Justice?
So we have a variety of programs at Americans for Immigrant Justice. We have 6 different programs, legal programs. We have children, we have family defense, we have a pro bono arm, we have an impact litigation and policy arm, and we have a detention arm. And then we also have a special victims, domestic violence, and trafficking arm. So depending on where one is placed, it may look a little different. I think across the board, we are all always meeting with other partners, coalition groups, to really see what's happening on the landscape, what the emergencies are, and how we are developing a response to enforcement action that really targets vulnerable people, where vulnerable individuals will need legal assistance in immigrant defense. So depends on what program. And, of course, even our development team, there's a piece of advocacy that they incorporate into their work, positive narratives and storytelling pertaining to immigration and what immigration means in the United States and how that has evolved and shaped our country and really made us a nation of immigrants and created this nation that is like no other in terms of the depth and the wealth and the diversity that we have in so many immigrant populations. So I would say that the coalition building is across the board. There's a lot of work pertaining to know your rights. We have our dedicated children's attorneys that visit detained children in shelters. We represent all children in the Miami Court jurisdiction shelters. We do some sort of orientation and intake of unaccompanied minors. Any child who is in a shelter does receive that engagement by Americans for Immigrant Justice. And this is really, really important. These children, many of them are abused, abandoned, and neglected here alone in the US. Really, our attorneys become that first point of contact, that first adult that they learn to trust and begin learning about their process and what needs to happen next in terms of their legal matter. We do family preparedness clinics. I would say that overall, we do right now, in the conditions that we feel like emergency room doctors. And so even the refinement of the work that we do and having to pivot often day to day on the most needy situation, we find ourselves doing that all the time. Somebody else who has been arrested or an extreme situation where somebody may have been precipitously deported or the brink of deportation, yet having a legal mechanism that they shouldn't be deported. I just want to give a couple statistics. We're talking more than a 2,450% increase in non-criminal arrests. So these are our families. These are our mixed status families, many families that have U.S. citizen children. The statistics show that over 100,000 U.S. citizen children have been impacted by enforcement of a non-citizen parent. 2% of new deportation cases, newly filed deportation cases, have criminal history. So I'm trying to really hone in on the fact that what I think the American public was told, which was the worst, the most dangerous, those are the immigrants who are being targeted. Our communities are going to be safer. But the fact that this really sharp increase, the wide expansion of detention that has occurred, the statistics and the facts speak for themselves. This is not about focusing on the most dangerous and keeping our community safer. Our community members, brothers, sisters, uncles, cousins, people are just being targeted just across the board. And it's important, I think, for there to be awareness on that, especially a place like the state of Florida, where there's such a deep cooperation between state and local law enforcement and ICE, and the American public understanding that when our resources from state and local enforcement are targeted towards immigration enforcement, it keeps our communities less safe. And why would we need to do that when we're talking about populations that have been working hard, paying taxes and contributing to our communities? It doesn't really make sense. I would, encourage people to think about that, those that piece of information on the fact that so many of our resources are being targeted in the wrong way, for, a lot of, I think, generational impact that we're going to see in the future, whether it's our US citizen children, whether it's our non-citizen children, just our next generation is going to be severely impacted by this moment in history.
I want to jump in there because, the science is so incredibly clear that family separation has traumatic and detrimental impacts on young children. The Society for Research in Child Development had a policy brief that talked about this. I think it was in 2017 during the family separation enactment during the first administration. And the brief highlights, all we know about the impact of family separation across various contexts, but particularly in the context of immigration. And, these children, to Sui's point, are going to have detriments. They're going to be impacted. Obviously, children are fairly resilient, but these children are essentially experiencing this traumatic experience. And, what impact is this going to have long term on their adjustment, on their capacity to succeed, to thrive, right? So even from like that foundational bit of just thinking about the children, whether they're U.S. born children or not, that I think that's an important bit that we have to shed light on it from the psychological science bit, and we have to talk about that again from a purely objective empirical basis. Family separation is extremely difficult and challenging for children.
And, I want to state that I think that when we think about those words, family separation, we do think about those images and those, the crying that we heard from the border stories, parents bringing their children, being separated at the border. And that was, the prior 2 administrations ago when that occurred. What we're not understanding, I think, as an American public is that that is not family separation today. Family separation is every single day in every single city in America where families are being separated, in the interior, and this tremendous impact is occurring. And, the evolution of those who are not subjected to enforcement action, I think that has changed the psychology of our children, of our, college students, of our just everybody, which is us and them. Do I need to carry a U.S. passport? Do I need to carry my birth certificate? Do I look different? Or am I going to, be pulled over just because I look like an immigrant? And it's causing this divide that prevents us from being a nation of immigrants. That is what the U.S. is really, our identity is based on, is the fact that so many different nations have come together and immigrated to this nation. And instead, it's really redefining even who belongs as a U.S. citizen, and kind of a secondary status for even those who do have status. Am I going to be subjected to some sort of racial profiling or, some cultural aspect of enforcement action? So we don't know how this is all going to play out. I think when we look back at this time in history and the studies show what the psychological impact is, it's going to be very grave. And I want to mention, there's other aspects coming into this, which is people can find $1.8 million if they had a deportation order and they've overstayed that. There's a variety of reasons why one might have a deportation order that they may not even know about. It could have been executed because they were a minor and they didn't know about it. It could have been executed 30 years ago. We see that a lot in our Cuban communities. But people being pressed with these $1.8 million fines and these notices, it is affecting next generations as well, where families are saying, you know what, this is just entirely too scary, despite the fact that I've built, a business, communities, and, successfully employed 100 people. We need to leave because this is just too scary for us. And I think that subsequently affects second, third, fourth generations to come, families that really would have contributed to the U.S. economy and our communities. And the specter of something like continued enforcement action with individuals being placed somewhere like warehouses the American public, we can't accept this. We can't think that this is okay, in a country that we're supposed to uphold all of our constitutional rights and we have a respect for human rights. The fact that these conversations are happening about placing immigrants into warehouses and many mistakes happen, whether you have status, whether you're a citizen, people being swept up and disappearing into warehouses it's a really scary thought.
Dr. Meca, you've been studying immigration, immigrant identity, American identity for a long time. Have you seen changes over the last, 10 or so years in immigrants' experiences in the United States in your research?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big contributions I have made is advancing the study of like U.S. identity and how people identify with Americanism and the role that that identification plays in mental health and well-being and health outcomes. And going to that prior point, right? Like some of my work and others internationally have highlighted that when individuals experience these kind of stressors like discrimination, like whether it's interpersonal discrimination, or we're talking about this broader institutional degree of discrimination, or otherness, foreign objectification, etc. It leads individuals to essentially distance themselves from the group that's engaging in that behavior, and this is referred to as the rejection disidentification model that's been recently highlighted in work that was coming out of I'm blanking off where it's coming from, but definitely not in the US, but now it's been applied here in this context. So to the earlier point, right, this current context, there's substantial evidence that would indicate that a lot of these experiences are going to lead not just the individuals who experience them, but their children, their family members to essentially say, like, well, maybe I'm not maybe I'm not welcomed here, right? So why would I embrace this American identity? Why would I want to establish that connection, right? Um, Rejection essentially serves as a way of creating distance. It's not surprising, right? Like, I mean, if you think about this in ordinary language, like if someone says, no, I don't want to date you, you're not like, yay, like it's like, okay, bye, right? It's the same kind of process here. What we're seeing as a whole, and this is not just exclusive to immigrant populations, but we are seeing that a sense of patriotism, a sense of U.S. identity has declined over the last about 2 decades. This has been tracked by the Gallup poll for quite a while. I think now they're actually not going to be tracking it anymore, so we'll see how we get good nationwide data on this. Now, I do want to emphasize, though, because I think one of the myths that I've shown in some of my work is that most immigrants, or I say the largest group of orientation that we tend to see among immigrant youth in particular, but even adult immigrant populations, is a sense of biculturalism, is a sense of I am proud of where I came from and I want to contribute to American society. One of the papers that I did with some of my colleagues, Corey Cobb and Seth Schwartz, was with undocumented immigrants based on the data that we collected in Little Rock, Arkansas, and surrounding areas. And what we found there was over a third, I think it was around 38% of the sample, had high levels of American identity and high levels of their ethnic racial heritage identity. And what that shows is that even among populations, I will say this data now is about like 8 years old, but even among among undocumented populations that may necessarily have pathways towards residency, there is this desire for integration, rooted as well in maintaining one's cultural heritage. So with the experiences of these stressors, essentially what we're doing is we're degrading, eroding, these populations' desire to embrace this identity, right? To view like they are accepted members of this society, right? So that's kind of like what the scientific, empirical literature would say about this. And the other thing I would add too is that like my own work has shown that this has mental health implications. Individuals who have a very positive, strong sense of U.S. identity, who feel that they are American, are doing better. They have higher self-esteem. They have higher psychological well-being, at least particularly in the context of youth population, which is where a lot of my work has focused on. So, this is like a combination of as a society, what kind of messaging do we want to be sending, right? The empirical literature would say that messaging that others that rejects the immigrant leads them to reject us back. And that can compromise their own adjustments, right? So that's kind of like what the scientific empirical basis here is a lot of what we're talking about.
Thank you so much. Sui, one of the things that you said that really struck me was that Americans for Immigrant Justice are often the first point of contact for children separated from their families. And of course, that jarring statistic about the percentage of family separations increasing so dramatically over the last few years. Tell me a little bit more about some of the challenges Americans for Immigrant Justice faces, how you're dealing with it, and what the listeners who are hearing this can do.
The day-to-day challenges, it really is about the constant pivot and emergencies, the system and the legal challenges, the changes that have occurred so precipitously. So defenses that were more standard or straightforward, they're more difficult to attain right now. So the day-to-day challenges, it's not just a legal defense aspect, but it is the fact that people are getting swept so quickly and placed into a system that is more difficult and challenging to navigate. So we may receive a call that somebody has been taken into custody. We're ready to engage with that individual, conduct an intake, and suddenly they've been sent to Louisiana or to Texas or to California, or they've been bounced around, or it could be our client. We've been working with them for 6 years, 8 years. They may have been a victim of a violent crime and their case was pending, and suddenly they're being bounced around, and it's hard for us to find them or even us to continue representation because of our funding limitations on direct services within the state of Florida. So there are a variety of things. It's not just the legal challenge, it's the enforcement mechanisms that are at play, but also this aspect of funding. We assist those who are 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, and we never charge a fee. So we're only assisting those who are low income, and the bulk of our direct services, it is for unaccompanied children. So there are a lot of factors at play in terms of how we're sustaining our work, how we can keep moving forward. There have been push factors where private funding has decreased. Our federal funding for children is at risk right now. So in order to continue the work, it is this, mad dash of ensuring that there is support for us to continue building legal defense, having attorneys on the landscape, and really thinking about the exhaustion of our attorneys and the ability to continue with this work, keep up with the changes, keep up with, training them and finding individuals who want to continue working in immigrant justice. People are, it really is a difficult calling right now. And I can't say enough about our team being so dedicated to this work and moving forward. Last year, we received over 20,000 calls on our detention hotline. We were able to attend to more than 13,000, and over and over and over, we are told by family members and immigrants in detention, you are the only entity that is picking up the phone. We can't go anywhere else. And the fact that individuals are so desperate, and nationwide, more than 79% are without counsel. That's with an entity like Americans for Immigrant Justice representing so many. Such a high percentage are without counsel, even children navigating this very, very complicated system. The reality is that a lot of people are not receiving due process because they don't have an attorney. There are scenarios where individuals have been deported. We had a client who had DACA plus another legal mechanism, a stay of removal, still deported. We had to bring that client back after 9 months. That's how long the process took. But if we had not been counsel, this young person would never have been able to return because there was no ability to make the claims without counsel's assistance. We receive calls from individuals who are veterans who may not know that they can renew their permanent residency, eligibility for citizenship. We have active duty members with immediate family members who are subjected to deportation, yet those family members might be eligible for relief. So it's a big scramble of, well, the people are eligible for protections, for relief, yet they're not being given the time and not given that review in order for it to play out. So I think that's a really key piece that is coming into the concept of why this is such an exhausting system, is that this concept of what we say is prosecutorial discretion does no longer exist in the immigration landscape, or it's very, very minimal. So, asking those questions, do you have an application pending? Are we really able to execute any type of deportation or removal? How many family members do you have? Do you have minor children in the home? These types of questions and this secondary review, really, it's not there anymore. And so the landscape is fast. With us trying to respond to those needs, it's very difficult.
Let me ask then, because we have Dr. Meca here, what do you see as the role of researchers in helping address these challenges? What do you need from brain and behavioral science to do your work? What questions do you want answered?
Statistics show, with our kids who are seeking asylum, it's something like 78% have suffered physical violence, 70% have suffered some sort of violent or death threats against them or their families. I'm surprised at the statistics, 20% of the children have been subjected to sexual violence. I personally, as an immigration defense attorney, I feel that statistic is probably low based on my contact, with children and families. Studies have to be devoted more to the fact that so many children are being affected, by the violent circumstances. Our world in many ways has become smaller in terms of, technology has brought us closer together, our ability to engage in conversations and understand more about different cultures, different countries. And it's an opportunity for us to understand what's happening on the international landscape, but also children who are here in the US who need to have protections from this type of violence. Some of the statistics from detention are that children are at risk. I think it's something like 12% could suffer malnutrition in US detention, in family detention, which is stunning. In the United States, that percentage would exist, and that it's something like over 20% could suffer from stunting. So I think the studies on children and support for children and mental health, the next generation, it's really important. Parents are being given really difficult choices, which is returning, giving up legal claims that they are entitled, they are legally eligible to pursue, and that the US laws allow them to pursue. They're being given that choice. Will you pursue legal mechanisms that you are able to pursue and eligible to pursue? The conditions of detention are so poor. Are you going to leave? Or the choice might be your child is going to be separated from you, detained elsewhere, or not detained, placed in DCF custody, or will you take this deportation order? So these are just really profound choices for families because they are coming to seek safety and protection for which they're eligible to pursue under the Immigration and Nationality Act. And so I think that, the expertise that we need is the psychological impact, whether it is a humanitarian-based claim, somebody who might be a recent arrival, or it might be a discretionary equities type of claim for a mixed status family and US-born children. What has been the impact when a non-citizen parent is faced with such difficult choices? I think from the academic and the medical community, we need more individuals coming forward and offering that expertise, whether it be written affidavits, whether it be research articles, publications, so that we can use them as corroboration for our immigrant population who are in the process of removal proceedings, and the offer to testify in court of the psychological impact on families and children. These are important pieces that I think that we really need to have support for, because it's difficult. It's assembling these types of cases. So it not just about the trauma from the client's perspective, but also in terms of what is this doing to our American public, understanding, how the American public is absorbing what they attribute blame in terms of economic changes, and some of the studies, and really pushing towards what we call facts as opposed to this push towards fear-based narrative. So how and why has immigration been placed in the conversation? What are some of the other aspects at play, whether it's private prison industry, the explosion of immigration detention, these types of studies and the psychological impact and how narrative is being formed? I think these are all areas of support that we need.
As I'm listening to a lot of this, which thank you for sharing. I think that having these conversations are sort of vital. A lot that comes to my mind is like, well, we know this, we know this, we know this. Like we the documentation around the impacts, the detrimental impacts of trauma are so substantial, right? The ideas of like what leads to compelling arguments or not compelling arguments are very well substantiated in the literature and keep expanding. I think what my takeaway from like the request that like this need is that we have failed as academia, as scientists, to really relay this information in ways that are digestible for individuals who are in positions like you, and trying to make these kind of advocates, right? And I think for the most part, that's not a surprising statement to make. I mean, there's like the whole notion of the ivory tower for a reason. I think this highlights the need for scientists to really think about ways in which we can, make our work more accessible for individuals who can leverage that work in cases like, what you're doing, right? Because the science, like I mentioned before, the science on family separation, whether it was in the context of, what happened at the border, oh my God, it's a decade ago, or what's happening now, right? Like the science of family separation showcases that family separation has long-term consequences on youth. The science on traumatic experiences, which include child sexual trauma, shows that it has long-term negative effects on youth. A lot of this is very well established science. It just hasn't made it in ways that are easily digestible for people who are appearing before a judge and, want to kind of leverage this science, right? I think the other bit is how do we leverage, academia, scientists into contexts that we are not familiar with, right? So I think to your point, like having scientific experts coming to court essentially and providing scientific testimony, right? That's not something that I have ever been trained in. I don't know if I would necessarily say that I would make a good scientific expert. But this I think highlights this need for a training gap that we are not really preparing anyone for. I mean, I will say that academia as a whole often has us do things that we're not trained to do at all. I seem to recall being asked to teach a week before and then being like just thrown into a classroom and it's like figure it out. But I think as we're thinking about how we structure our doctoral trainings or even our graduate trainings, right? This I'm thinking of, okay, how do we prepare students, right, to do these kind of things like expert witness, that's what it is, right? Expert witness testimony in ways that are going to make compelling cases, right? Because there's a way to do this, right? How do we make our science more accessible, right? Do we need something that's more of a bridge, right? I think of like science media experts who are proficient enough in understanding science, but also can kind of communicate back and forth and do these kind of things, right? The other thing that strikes me a lot in the conversations that you have brought up, and this is an area that I don't think is well studied, but it is role overload is definitely well established as a psychological construct, particularly in the industrial organizational field. But to me, everything that you were talking about in terms of the experiences of advocates like you and immigration attorneys highlights that right now you are a population that is experiencing role overload, that you are really being pushed to severe tension. And it reminds me a lot of what we're seeing, for example, what some of the literature has shown around among firefighters and 911 dispatchers, this secondhand trauma exposure that in and of itself can be potentially traumatizing, right? That has long-term implications because I would imagine that the retention rate is probably being impacted, right? It's really hard to stick in these kind of things when you're exposed to these things, right? So I also wonder about what services, what support could be provided for the people who are in the field who are doing this kind of work. And the other bit too that I would add here is the line between psychological sciences and psychological services, right? I can't speak as well to the psychological service side, but I think it's a pretty well established fact that across this country we have a mental health service shortage. We do not have enough mental health professionals to really step into these roles. And the fact that right now people like yourselves are really kind of taking on the role of not just lawyer, but also almost social work. Like when you said that you're sometimes the first person that some of these children have spoken to, right? Like, and that you're having to build their relationships, create a source of security and trust, like, that's, I'm sure, a role that you may not have been prepared for in law school, I would imagine, right? So I wonder, like, how do we, create, like, some of this is in part rooted in the fact that we have mental health shortages or mental health services shortages, but then also, when, I'm thinking about how we collaboratively design curriculum for lawyers and training who are doing this kind of work that thinks about like the developmental specificity of children or uses quasi-counseling skills to really make this process more tenable, right? Licensed clinical psychologists or, licensed mental health professionals get training in how to handle some of these challenges, of the work that they're doing, right? I'm not sure how much of that incorporates into the law school training, but those are another element, I think, of potential future directions that I think is something to be considered, given the current context that I think you're speaking to. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
Appreciate all that.
Oh, I see so many opportunities for collaboration, and I hope we can continue this conversation offline, but we have essentially run out of time. Thank you both for your expertise, for sharing so authentically. Sui, I'll give you the last word. Is there anything else you want listeners to know?
I really feel that in these conversations, the American public has also been villainized in not responding to what's happening on the landscape. And, when we see what has been happening in different cities and the tentativeness of so many people who are coming forward, non-attorneys, people in the community, and wanting to support and protect others, it's really, I think, goes to the quote that our founding executive director is always saying, is to keep hope alive. And, when we see this, I think that it really invigorates those who are on the front lines on the legal landscape, the fact that so many people do care about, their neighbor and humankind. So really, grateful for that investment, the fact that communities are coming together in order to support immigrants and children.
Thank you both. Thank you for ending that message with hope. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.